Hazardous Materials for First Responders, 5th edition. This is Chapter 2, Analyzing the Incident, Recognizing and Identifying the Presence of Hazardous Materials. The lesson goal of this chapter is the student shall be able to recognize the presence and hazards of hazardous materials and understand the 7 clues for identifying them. There are 10 objectives to this chapter. The first is to restate the 7 clues to the presence of hazardous materials. The second is to explain how pre-incident plans, occupancy types, and locations may indicate the presence of hazardous materials. The third is to identify basic container shapes that indicate the presence and hazards of hazardous materials. The fourth is to describe ways that U.S. transportation placards, labels, and markings indicate the presence and hazards of hazardous materials. The fifth is to describe ways that Canadian transportation placards, labels, and markings indicate the presence and hazards of hazardous materials. The sixth is to describe the ways that Mexican transportation placards, labels, and markings indicate the presence and hazards of hazardous materials. The seventh is to identify other markings and colors that indicate the presence of hazardous materials. Number 8 is to describe ways written resources are used to identify hazardous materials and their hazards. The ninth is to explain the limited role of the 5 senses for identifying hazardous materials. And finally, the 10th and last is to explain the role of monitoring and using detection devices for awareness level personnel. This first section is to restate the 7 clues of the presence of hazardous materials. There are 7 clues to the presence of hazardous material. The awareness level personnel and first responders must be able to analyze all incidents in order to detect and identify the presence of hazardous materials. Incidents involving hazmat can be controlled only when the personnel involved have sufficient information to make informed decisions. The time and effort devoted to identifying the contents of building, vehicles, and containers result in greater safety for first responders and the community. Historically, first responders' failure to recognize hazardous materials at accidents, fires, spills, and other emergencies has caused unnecessary injuries and deaths. Once hazmat is detected, first responders can use a number of resources to identify it and its potential hazards. With that information, first responders can initiate appropriate response actions and perform them confidentially. Some hazmat identification clues are easily visible at a distance, while others require responders to be much more closer. The closer you need to be in order to identify the material, the greater your chances of being in an area where you could be exposed to a harmful effect. In general, distance often equates to safety when hazmat is involved. The 7 clues to the presence of hazardous materials are occupancy types, locations and pre-incident surveys, container shapes, transportation placards, labels and markings, other markings and colors, written resources, senses, monitoring and detection devices. This chapter will describe these 7 clues in detail. The order of the clues also represents, in general, an increasing level of risk to the responders. For example, using monitoring and detection equipment to identify hazmat is more likely to place responders in dangerous areas than using occupancy types or container shapes to provide information. The review question for Section 1 is to list the 7 clues to the presence of hazardous materials. To find this answer, look on page 46 of the manual.